In the Middle Ages, life was rooted in the rhythms of nature, and one of the most basic human needs, relieving oneself, was a task handled without the convenience of modern plumbing. For most people, this routine part of daily life was managed using simple, practical, and often very public solutions. In villages and countryside homes, chamber pots were kept under beds or in corners of the room. These were not just used at night but throughout the day, especially during bad weather or in the cold months when going outside was unpleasant. Once full, the pot would be emptied into a pit, a nearby field, or sometimes just tossed onto the street, especially in crowded towns. There were no private bathrooms, no running water, and no flushing mechanisms. People adapted with what they had. A wooden bench with a hole in it placed over a trench was enough for some rural households. Others would walk to the edge of their land or into the woods for privacy, wrapping cloaks around themselves or going at dawn or dusk when fewer eyes were around. Children were often taught from a young age to manage without shame, since these practices were a part of life and everyone did it. The lack of privacy, the smells, and the discomfort were accepted without much question. After all, no one knew anything else. In medieval towns, the situation was even more complicated. Streets were narrow, houses were packed close together, and the population was constantly growing. Without any sewer systems, waste had to go somewhere. Many households still used chamber pots, but with little private land, the contents were often flung out of windows or doors. People would shout warnings, often a version of "watch out below," before tossing out the contents, hoping passers-by heard in time. The ground-level areas near buildings became foul-smelling and hazardous, especially in warmer seasons. Some wealthier homes had rudimentary privies, small wooden structures in the backyard with a deep pit underneath. But most city dwellers didn't have the space for this. Instead, towns tried to manage the waste by appointing workers known as night soil collectors, whose job was to collect human waste and transport it outside the city. These workers were essential to keeping the cities from becoming unlivable, though they were often looked down upon socially. In places like London, there were public regulations about when and where waste could be thrown, but enforcement was inconsistent. Rainy days were both a curse and a blessing. It helped wash the streets clean, but it also spread contamination farther. The risk of disease was ever present, but not fully understood. People simply lived with the reality that their streets doubled as waste disposal areas. Inside castles, the experience was slightly different, but still far from modern standards. Nobles and royalty had access to slightly more advanced systems, such as garderobes, small stone rooms built into the walls of castles, where waste would drop down a chute into a pit or moat below. These spaces were cold, drafty, and still emitted strong odors, but they offered more privacy than the open-field methods used by peasants. Garderobes were often placed on outer walls and designed so that the waste dropped far from living areas, although the system wasn't perfect. Some castles even used a form of running water, with streams diverted beneath the latrine chutes to help carry away waste. Despite these efforts, hygiene was still limited. The seats were made of wood or stone, and cleaning supplies were minimal. Cloth scraps, moss, hay, and sometimes even smooth stones were used instead of toilet paper. Servants were responsible for cleaning these areas and emptying portable pots used in the bedchambers. These servants, like the night soil collectors in towns, performed essential but unpleasant work. Even in royal settings, managing bodily functions required effort, ingenuity, and acceptance of discomfort. The air in some parts of a castle could grow heavy with unpleasant smells, especially in summer, and people burned herbs or incense to mask the stench. In monasteries and religious houses, the rules around sanitation were often more structured. Monks and nuns lived by routines, and their communities frequently included communal latrines. These were sometimes long stone benches with holes, built over running water channels if available. The monastic concern for ritual cleanliness extended to bodily functions, though the understanding was more spiritual than scientific. Monasteries had designated places for washing and relieving oneself, and their design reflected a quiet efficiency. In some large religious complexes, water systems were developed to flush waste away using gravity and diverted streams. This was a major advancement compared to the towns and villages, but such systems were rare and usually found only in wealthy or well-organized institutions. Cleanliness was encouraged, but it didn't necessarily translate into true hygiene by modern standards. Water was used for purification and symbolic washing, and illness was often attributed to spiritual imbalance rather than bacteria. Nevertheless, Life in a monastery offered one of the cleanest environments available at the time. The silence of monastic life, the stone walls, and the echoing halls gave a sense of calm order, even in matters as mundane as relieving the body. Despite all of these adaptations, medieval people rarely spoke openly about these things. There was no taboo in the same way modern society treats bathroom habits, but there was also no polite conversation about it. It was simply part of life, managed with practical tools and methods, and accepted without fuss. People lived close to one another, often sharing small spaces with family and animals, and privacy was a luxury. The smell of waste was common, especially in summer, but so were the sense of open fires, unwashed clothes, and cooked meat. It all blended together in a sensory landscape very different from our own. Clean water was precious and not always available, so washing was infrequent. The connection between waste and disease was not yet understood. So many illnesses were blamed on bad air, divine punishment, or imbalances of the body's humors. For most, the lack of a toilet wasn't even seen as a problem. It was just the way things were. People carried on, day by day, living their lives in rhythm with the sun, the seasons, and the needs of the body. They didn't long for flush toilets or hand soap, because they had never known such things. Instead, they made do, with a chamber pot under the bed, a quiet trip to the forest, or a garderobe in a stone tower, and with a resilience shaped by necessity and simplicity. In many parts of the medieval world, where homes were clustered in towns and castles loomed over villages, the challenge of managing human waste extended beyond personal solutions like chamber pots. Entire communities had to find ways to cope with the daily needs of large populations, all living without plumbing or underground sewer systems. While rural peasants often went to nearby forests or used open fields, townspeople had fewer options. In some cases, simple wooden or stone latrines were built behind houses, with pits dug underneath them. These pits would eventually fill, and someone had to remove the waste or dig a new one. In larger settlements, authorities tried to centralize waste disposal by building public latrines, often placed near rivers, moats, or ravines where gravity and water could help carry away the waste. These were rudimentary but served a shared function. It was not unusual to find a long bench with several openings, used communally by men, women, and children. There were few partitions, and little concern for privacy. The focus was on necessity. People waited their turn, talked during the process, and left quickly. The sound of moving water below these latrines helped carry the waste away, but also filled the air with a damp, earthy smell that clung to stone walls and wooden floors. In cities where waterways were nearby, engineers and builders began designing latrines that extended over rivers. These were known as bridge latrines or river toilets. They could be simple wooden platforms built out over the edge of a bridge or riverbank, with holes cut into the planks. Waste would fall directly into the moving water below. While this may sound primitive by modern standards, at the time, it was considered clever and efficient. Some bridges, especially in larger towns, were fitted with small wooden boxes called garderobes that projected over the water. These little cubicles were often communal and unventilated, meaning that the experience was far from pleasant. Still, for people who lived nearby, it was better than nothing. In some towns, these latrines were reserved for certain guilds, markets, or travelers. Merchants and visitors would stop to relieve themselves before continuing their day. Yet as population density increased, so did the problems. Rivers became contaminated. The flow of water was not always enough to carry everything away, especially during dry seasons. People living downstream suffered most, drawing drinking water from sources already polluted by waste. But knowledge of waterborne illness was limited. Most assumed that illness came from foul smells or divine punishment, not contaminated streams. In monasteries and abbeys, which functioned as both religious centers and organized communities, sanitation was more carefully planned. Monastic architects often constructed long rows of stone or wooden latrines built directly over flowing water channels. These were known as reredouters and were often connected to the dormitories where monks slept. Each morning, monks would rise early and, following their silent routines, make their way to the communal latrine. Dozens could be seated at once, quietly attending to their needs as water beneath them helped remove waste. It was a solemn process, not rushed, and part of the daily order. The design was functional and maintained with care, and these monastic systems were some of the most advanced public sanitation methods of the era. Water was channeled from nearby springs, rain catchments, or redirected rivers, using gravity and stone aqueducts. Monks were tasked with keeping the channels clean and free of blockages. These were not luxurious facilities, but they were relatively clean and efficient. Unlike the chaotic streets of towns, the monastery latrine reflected discipline and structure. It was one of the few places in medieval society where sanitation was treated as a community priority, not just an individual problem. Castles, too, were designed with some attention to shared relief areas, especially when housing soldiers, servants, and guests. Within their high walls, castles could be home to dozens or even hundreds of people. Communal needs had to be addressed. In addition to private garderobes for the lord and lady, larger castles included shared latrines for staff and soldiers. These were often built into the thickness of outer walls, with shafts descending several meters to pits or ditches. Some castles had a network of these shafts, connected to keep the waste away from food stores, living areas, and chapels. In some fortresses, these shared latrines were enclosed in towers or turrets that projected from the walls. The waste fell into pits or running water below, sometimes collected for use as fertilizer. But these areas were rarely cleaned thoroughly. The smell lingered. Rats and insects were common. Guards used these areas at night, often without light, navigating by memory and familiarity. Servants were assigned to maintain these spaces, though maintenance was limited to shoveling out the pits or redirecting flow. In times of siege, when water supplies were low and the castle was sealed from the outside world, these communal latrines became particularly unpleasant. Waste built up, the smell intensified, and the health of the castle's inhabitants suffered. Yet people endured, as they always did. Public awareness of sanitation began to rise slowly, driven by practical needs more than science. In some cities, early ordinances were passed that required residents to build latrines or dispose of waste in designated areas. Fines were issued for throwing waste into streets or letting it drain into neighboring properties. Night soil collectors were hired to empty pits and haul the contents outside city walls. These jobs were dangerous, physically demanding, and looked down upon. Still, they were necessary, and towns that enforced waste regulations fared better in terms of health and livability. Some even built communal latrines near marketplaces or town squares, though they were basic in design, usually just wooden walls around a row of pits. No water, no ventilation, and certainly no privacy. But for travelers, laborers, and townsfolk, these were a welcome convenience. Over time, as cities expanded and knowledge slowly grew, more efforts were made to manage waste at a community level. But in the heart of the Middle Ages, public sanitation remained a mix of tradition, improvisation, and necessity. The people of that time knew no other way, and despite the odors and discomforts, life continued with a kind of quiet, gritty resilience that defined their world. For many people in the Middle Ages, the act of relieving oneself was not just a physical necessity, it was quietly woven into the beliefs, customs, and superstitions of the time. Cleanliness was not yet understood through the lens of science. Instead, it was deeply connected to ideas of morality, sin, and purity. Religious teachings often influenced how people thought about their own bodies and the functions they could not control. In Christian Europe, the human body was seen as both a vessel of divine creation and a source of temptation and weakness. Bodily waste, being associated with impurity, was rarely discussed openly. Monks and theologians debated whether physical cleanliness brought spiritual clarity. The act of washing or bathing was not always for hygiene but for symbolic purification. In some religious texts, excessive concern for the body was even considered vain or distracting from spiritual goals. Still, in monasteries and abbeys, regular rituals of washing hands and faces were common, and certain orders emphasized bodily discipline as a form of devotion. Waste itself, however, was often hidden, taken away quietly, removed from sight, and not spoken of in polite company. This silence shaped how sanitation evolved. Because it was rarely discussed, it was rarely improved. In Islamic cities during the same period, attitudes toward cleanliness were often more structured and emphasized. Cleanliness was considered a core part of daily life and religious practice. People were expected to wash before prayers, after relieving themselves, and before eating. These ideas had practical benefits, even if people didn't yet understand germs. Public bathhouses were common in Islamic lands, and some cities had surprisingly advanced waste systems with drains, cesspits, and water channels. In regions like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, engineers and scholars paid attention to water flow and urban planning. In contrast, Many European towns lagged behind, treating waste as something to simply throw away rather than manage thoughtfully. This divide in attitudes shows how beliefs, spiritual and cultural, shaped sanitation habits in different civilizations. While European societies treated waste as something embarrassing or unmentionable, others saw cleanliness as part of daily discipline. Still, even in cleaner societies, the absence of modern toilets meant people had to be resourceful. Pits were dug, water was carried, and private spaces were created out of necessity. Sanitation was not always elegant, but it was deeply shaped by the values people lived by. As cities grew in size and complexity, the need for better waste management became harder to ignore. Without organized sewage systems, waste collected in streets, alleys, courtyards, and even near places of worship. The odors became unbearable during the summer, and outbreaks of illness seemed to follow periods of heavy rain or standing waste. Yet the connection between sanitation and health was not yet scientifically known. Instead, people believed that bad air, also known as miasma, was the source of sickness. It made sense at the time. Foul smells were often followed by fever and death, so the air itself was blamed. Efforts to improve sanitation focused on controlling smell rather than the waste itself. Herbs were burned in the streets, sweet-smelling flowers were hung in homes, and perfumes were dabbed under the nose to block the stench. During times of plague or widespread illness, people held cloths soaked in vinegar over their mouths. But even these methods, while ineffective against disease, showed that people were trying to protect themselves in the best way they understood. Slowly, through observation and trial, some began to notice patterns. Areas with better drainage or cleaner streets often experienced fewer outbreaks. These quiet realizations laid the groundwork for future change. By the late Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, subtle shifts began to occur. Cities began appointing officials to oversee sanitation. Waste collectors, once hired informally, were given more formal roles. Some towns passed laws requiring homeowners to build private latrines or dispose of chamber pot contents in designated areas. The early seeds of public health policies were being planted. New technologies emerged, such as vaulted cesspits and clay pipes, which helped direct waste away from living areas. These advancements were slow, uneven, and often resisted by those who saw no problem with the old ways. But gradually, the belief that waste should be hidden gave way to the idea that it should be managed. This shift was not caused by scientific discovery alone, it was also shaped by changing attitudes. People began to expect cleaner streets. They valued fresh air, not just for comfort but for well-being. Travelers and merchants, moving between cities and cultures, shared ideas. What worked in one region was sometimes copied in another. The world was slowly growing more connected, and with that came a deeper understanding of how the unseen parts of life, like waste, could affect the visible ones, like health and comfort. Yet for most people living in the Middle Ages, these changes came too slowly to notice. They were born into a world without toilets, grew up learning how to use chamber pots, forest edges, or stone benches with holes, and they passed those lessons to their children. The discomforts were real, but they were accepted. A child might be taught to empty the family pot into a trench behind the house before breakfast. A traveler might ask for directions to the nearest latrine, knowing it would be shared, dirty, and exposed to the wind. A monk might rise before dawn, walk in silence to the rearward order, and sit quietly while water rushed below. In these small routine moments, people found their own rhythm and dignity. They did not long for modern conveniences because they had never known them. Instead, they managed their needs with a mixture of faith, habit, and patience. And over centuries, with each new idea and experiment, humanity slowly moved toward the modern world, one clean bucket, one pit, and one belief at a time.